All right, Dr. Casa, the rest of the class is coming in right on the bell here. So for everybody that's in here, Dr. Casa is, can you hear me, Doug?
I can, yes.
Okay. Dr. Casa is basically the world's leading expert in this particular topic of preventing heat illness and heat issues. His background in athletic training through his PhD. And we met on the Cliff Bar Advisory Council when we were on the scientific advisory board for that group. And then we share some common students, as I was telling you all earlier, between the universities. Is at UCONN, and he runs the Korey Stringer Institute, which is designed, maybe he'll tell us a little bit about that as well, specifically to handle issues around heat stroke and things. Korey Stringer died of one in practice, and I believe his wife put a bunch of money into an institute, and Doug got the bid, and they run a fantastic program up there. It's very, very impressive. I've asked him to come and do us this courtesy this morning, so we'll let you get into it, Dr. Casa, and just let's give him a warm welcome and see what we get.
All right, Mike, thanks for having me. Quite an honor to be with your class. A little bit of a history. As Mike had mentioned, two of my current PhD students are Florida State alums with their master's degree. They're both phenomenal. Mike, I don't know if you've heard, but basically every place Courtney has been applying for her professor spot has offered her phone interviews. She's done like 8 phone interviews in the last 3 days.
That's exhausting.
Yeah, but everyone wants her, so that's pretty cool. I graduated from University of Florida. I don't know if you can see my background right now. I don't know if you can see me at all. In 1993. I actually applied for master's at Florida State in 1990, but ended up not going there. So honored to be with you. As was mentioned, I run the Korey Stringer Institute at University of Connecticut. We have 80 employees. We have 60 volunteers and 20 staff. We work very closely with military, athletics, and labor populations to try to have them help maximize performance and safety, especially when they have to exercise in the heat. But overall, just global safety and performance issues as well. So we have kind of 2 sides of KSI. The left one is more the safety side, and then the right side is helping everybody who has to do intense exercise. Like I said, especially in the heat. Our mission is to provide research, education, advocacy, and consultation to maximize performance, optimize safety, and prevent sudden death for the athlete, warfighter, and labor. So a lot of our research grants right now, we have one big one with the Army, one big one with the Air Force, both looking at different new wearable technologies in the heat and hydration space. And we have a lot of other contracts for a similar kind of research. These are just the disclosures these are our corporate partners currently at the Korey Stringer Institute, just to make you aware. Just how I got into this field. I personally had an exertional heat stroke when I was 16 years old running a 10K race on the track. They had a wisdom of running the 10K, for anyone who's a runner in the room right now, that's 25 laps on the track, and they had their wisdom to run it at noontime on August 8th. And so it was very, very hot, and on the very final lap I collapsed, and then I was in a coma for about 7 hours from the heat stroke, and that was 1985. And basically since that moment, this is what I've been interested in and what I've studied. This person who's in the picture with me here is the person who actually saved my life from heat stroke. That was 1985, but I did not find out that Ken Scriber here saved my life until 2001 by serendipity at a conference where I was giving a presentation and told my story about heat stroke, and someone in the room was his former student who'd had heard the story as a student herself many years before and connected the two of us. So it's kind of cool. I'm going to skip these for now. Just this presentation I gave at the ACSM and NSCA had a regional combined conference in New York City back in April. So what I'm sharing with you is what I shared at that conference back in April. This is a book we recently published that focuses on the safety side of things that we do. So different chapters related to like cardiac, sickling, heat stroke, head injuries, asthma, things like that, of all the different emergencies that could happen in sport. And then specific to the heat, this is a book that we released last year, Sport and Physical Activity in the Heat, Maximizing Performance and Safety. And this is the deep dive on heat. So I think there's 19 different chapters that consider all the different factors of what you have to think about to perform well in the heat and to do so safely. We have a book coming out, very exciting, and Mike will be excited about this, next month. It's called Elite Soccer Performance, and your professor there was the author of one of our chapters, and that's being released in just a few weeks, so we're very excited about that. These are some of the groups that we've assisted since KSI has been formed almost exactly 10 years ago, and you can notice a lot of like OSHA, NIOSH, things that affect laborers. Then you can see a lot of the military branches, so obviously things for our warfighters, and then you can see a lot of different sports medicine organizations and a lot of different athletic organizations. This just gives you a smattering of either ones we've partnered with research-wise, or we've assisted with their development of policies and procedures. I don't know if we have any soccer fans in the room. I know you're all about football at Florida State, although recently it's not gone so well. Soccer, you may notice in the center top is the symbol for the Portugal national team. And back in 2014, they hired me before the Brazil World Cup to assist for the 6 months before to get them ready for the heat of playing in the World Cup in Brazil. So some of the things we'll chat about today or things like that we assisted, for instance, that team with. This is the lab that we just opened at Korey Stringer Institute. This is our heat lab. It's a 500 square foot facility that we can take from 20 degrees Fahrenheit up to 120 degrees Fahrenheit, and then humidity from 20% to 90%, and wind speed from 0 to 20 miles an hour. And this is where we do a lot of our research. We have actually a second heat lab as well. It is functioning right now at about 120 hours a week of data collection between the two labs. So very, very busy. And we also can get our research subjects up to 104 degrees Fahrenheit, their body temperature. So that's one of the highest limits in the country. So we can really mimic real life situations for soldiers and athletes. This is just some other pictures of that facility. So when we think about some of the hot weather events that are coming up, I want to just kind of give you some perspective. And remember, I gave this talk in April, but the Olympics in 2020, I'll just show you this publication right now here. We released this last year. We predicted that the Tokyo Summer Olympics will be the hottest Summer Olympics in history when it happens next August. And that is based on us comparing it to the actual temperatures of every Olympics so far and the predicted temperatures for the days that they're going to be happening in August. So that is something that the International Olympic Committee is very concerned about, and they formed a special heat preparation sports medicine committee, and I've been part of that committee for 2 years to help them prepare to try to do it as safely as possible. Back in 1964, when the Olympics were in Tokyo, they moved the Olympics to October because of the fear of how hot it was going to be, and it's way hotter now in Tokyo, as not surprising to all of you, with global warming. So it's a solid like about 5 degrees warmer on those days, and it's still being kept in August. So obviously we're going to have some extreme circumstances to consider. But other hot weather things, you see the Olympics for 2020, but many of you may know that Paris has the Olympics for 2024, which this past year in Paris, they broke their all-time record for France for how hot it was. It was over 100 degrees on many days in a row. So Paris could be brutal. And then obviously in 2028, Los Angeles is hosting the Summer Olympics. So in August, so that could also be stifling hot. You may have followed, for any track and field fans in the room, the World Championships a couple weeks ago were in Doha. Doha is in Qatar, in the Middle East. So yes, they had the track and field World Championships in the Middle East in September. And it was always in the 90s each day. They ran the marathon starting at midnight for anybody who was watching those. I also helped them for the 2 years leading up to that race on their committee to get ready. I had nothing to do with picking the site of Doha, but I tried to help keep them as safely as possible. It was so hot there that they air conditioned the outdoor track and field stadium. So the stadium at ground level was air conditioned to keep the temperatures around 75 for the runners. But the 3 race walk events and the 2 marathons obviously had to be out on the roads. So those took some special precautions. The World Cup, many of you may have watched this past year, the Women's World Cup in France. They had some brutally hot days there. I had the good fortune of actually going to the final of the Women's World Cup and watching America win. Then the World Cup for soccer is going to be in Qatar in 2022. Thankfully, they moved it from July to December. So in December, it averages, low 90s, whereas in we've got 115 to 120 when a World Cup typically happens in July. So just trying to give you some things that are happening kind of on a world stage where people are always dealing with the heat. And obviously, it's only going to get worse as days and years progress. This is just an idea of, I work a lot with our U.S. national team. So this is our U.S. national boys U17 team. Help them get ready because their World Cup was in India and it was in late May. And they didn't have any game that it was under 90 degrees. So it was brutally hot conditions. This is an example of some of the cooling breaks. Some of you may know FIFA has instituted new rules for cooling breaks, where if it exceeds a certain environmental conditions, there's an additional break at the 30-minute mark at each half. It's currently 3 minutes in length. We're currently pushing FIFA right now to move it to a 6-minute break, so it could be a little more meaningful from a cooling and hydration perspective. For people who followed the news last year, especially people who maybe follow college football, Jordan McNair was an important story, I think, to understand. He died from exertional heat stroke in 2018. It happened in May of 18, but he passed away in June of 18 from the complications. Extremely unfortunate circumstances. They didn't recognize it quickly. They didn't do the right assessment. They didn't care for him properly in the immersion tub. And we can see on the screen that red book that's there. The university released the report. It's a 120-page report that you can find online. That is all the things that they did incorrectly in caring for Jordan McNair. So even though they're at a Power 5 conference football program, they did not have the things in place to properly care for Jordan. So the learnings that we've had from the past did not carry forward here. And very unfortunate because heat stroke is 100% survivable when treated correctly. Related to that, just trying to make you aware of some different resources that are out there. Back in 2012, we published a document, Preventing Sudden Death in Collegiate Conditioning Sessions. Back then, the NCAA did not endorse this document, unfortunately, but 14 sports medicine organizations did. But very thankfully, with the new leadership at NCAA from a sports medicine perspective, this past year, they did come out with almost a duplicate document this past summer, advocating for all the things we did back in 2012. So there's new guidelines now in place for college sports. I'm not going to get into some of these as much, so I can get into some of the. So I want you to think about this as we go through some of the factors to enhance performance and safety in the heat. First of all, what factors influence the rate of rise of body temperature during exercise, and what factors influence sweat rate? So I'm going to ask you guys right now a question. Mike, you're going to have to help guide me through this a little. Okay. What factors influence the rate of rise of body temperature during exercise? So I'm thinking about 6 items, and the first few we probably can put in terms of amount of impact. So I can probably give you the first, second, and third, and then there's probably a bit of randomness for the next few. So somebody raise their hand right now and tell me what's the biggest factors that influence the rate of rise of your body temperature during exercise?
Call it out. Exercise intensity from.
Yes. So thank you. So often when I do this, people they usually wait a while before they say this one. That is number 1, by far, the biggest factor that influences the rate of rise of body temperature during exercise. So thank you for saying that. What do you guys think of the other 5 that I'm looking for?
Clothing.
Yes. Clothing is probably somewhere around 4 or 5. So clothing / equipment would be like football players, field hockey goalies, but then think military people who have to have protective gear on, firefighters. So that's very important. That will definitely have you heat up faster. Good. What else?
Environment.
Thank you. That's number 2. So the environmental conditions, obviously the humidity, the dry bulb temperature, the radiation, the amount of wind, all of those will influence. So we put those together for environment. Okay. What are the other 3?
Anybody?
Come on, you're in Florida. What does everybody tell you to do in the summertime when you're exercising?
We had one exercise duration answer.
Yeah, I'll explain why that's not in the top 6 in a sec, but what else?
Hydration.
Thank you. Yes, that's what I'm looking for. So number 3 is probably hydration, or number 4. So to give you a little statistic, for every additional 1% body mass loss, your body temperature is about 0.5 degree Fahrenheit higher when you do intense exercise in the heat. So let me repeat that. For every additional 1% body mass loss, you're about a half a degree Fahrenheit hotter when you do intense exercise in the heat. So if you did an exercise session, say you did a 1 hour run and you finished 4% dehydrated based on your body weight, pre versus post. And then let's say you did that same run again in the same environmental conditions and you stayed hydrated that time and you're properly hydrated at the end, your body temperature would be a difference of 2 degrees Fahrenheit, which is a massive difference, especially from performance. Like one person be 105, one could be 103. So hydration obviously matters, but that relationship only shows during intense exercise in the heat. And those words are important because if it's exercise in the heat, it doesn't hold. Like if we were just hiking or backpacking, you don't see that. If we took the word heat out and it's just intense exercise, the relationship doesn't hold. So for instance, if you're running a marathon, elite marathon, or running a marathon at 48 degree Fahrenheit, that wouldn't hold. But if it's intense exercise in the heat, so a football player in August, a lot of military things, other things like that, that is where that relationship holds. So the two we haven't said so far are heat acclimatization. That's your physiological changes your body goes through when you do exercise in the heat. And the other one is in what I call individual factors. So that would be things like certain medications that you might be on that cause you to heat up, supplements, things like ephedra-based supplements, amphetamine-based medications, previous history of heat illnesses, particular genetic factors. I put that all in number 6 together of individual factors. All right, let's move on to the next question. And these are relevant before I talk about some of the strategies. What factors influence sweat rate? So why do some people, and why do you yourself have different sweat rates at different times? And then why do you have a different sweat rate than somebody else? Can somebody answer?
Body surface area.
Yes, that's good. So yeah, and this is usually one, so you guys come up with the right answers quickly. This is usually one that people wait a while to say, but so yes, I would put number 3 as the size of the person. So for instance, an American football lineman could be as high as 3 or 3.5 liters per hour. And versus a runner who might only be like 1.5 or 2 liters per hour, because obviously the runner might be 125 pounds and the football player might be 320 pounds. So very different in terms of skin surface area. What are the biggest 2 factors?
Work accomplished.
Yeah, so the intensity of the exercise is again the biggest factor. Think of what your sweat rate would be if you ran 5-minute miles for 10 miles in a row, if you could do that, or if you walk that same 10 miles. Okay, what's number 2?
We had environment.
Thank you. Yeah. So obviously the hotter it is, the higher your sweat rate is going to be. Other factors that have some influence are like heat acclimatization increases your sweat rate after about 10 to 14 days. So it's a double-edged sword there. The bigger sweat rate allows you obviously to cool more efficiently. The downside is you dehydrate faster. So you have to be aware of that and obviously try to take proper precautions to overcome that. In the question I asked earlier, it says, what factors influence the rate of rise during body temperature? Someone had said duration, and duration is important, but not with this particular question I'm asking, because you could go for 5 hours, and if you stay properly hydrated and it's lower intensity, like it's not going to really affect your body temperature. So the really big things were what you already said, was intensity and environmental conditions. Now, if you're going for a long time and you're not hydrating in that time, it could play, indirectly some role. So this is a bit of a complicated graph that Dr. Buller from the United States Army Research Institute for Environmental Medicine in Natick, Massachusetts had come up with, but I do think it's kind of important to conceptualize the different components to consider. So on your left, you could see the things that influence metabolism. Metabolism is obviously what's going to be generating the heat. So you see the right arrow coming out of that box. I don't know what color it's appearing on your screen, but say pink or something like that. That's heat production. Obviously, most of that heat is coming from the inefficiency of the work produced by your muscles, which I'm sure you guys have all had your ex-phys that, 75 or 80% of it is a bit of inefficiency, and it's generating heat and not just work. There are other things that can generate heat, and you see some of these here, like someone could have a fever when they're taking a practice field or start a competition. Eating could cause some heat to be generated. Certain drugs, for sure, as I mentioned earlier, pharmaceuticals could cause heat to be generated. we just published an extensive paper that's gotten some attention. It's just the microbiome in your gut alone generates heat because you have so many living organisms in your body that also have their own metabolism. So those are just some things to consider. And then so as you work your way to the middle of the screen, these are your body's mechanisms to try to now get this heat from the muscles to get it outside of the body, because we have to somehow get rid of this. So things like vasodilation will obviously help you lose heat, increasing skin blood flow, increasing your sweat rate. All of this leads us to the green box on the right is our mechanisms, which you learned in your basic ex-phys class, of convection, radiation, conduction, and evaporation are the different methods in which we can lose heat. Okay, so these are the things we're trying to overcome with the mechanisms I'm going to be chatting about in a second. And so obviously during exercise when it's really humid out, and I'm sure you may have covered this previously, but if it's really, so do you guys know what your resting skin temperature is? Not in the heat, just sitting there right now. Do you guys know what your skin temperature is?
No.
Okay, so it's about 93 degrees Fahrenheit sitting there right now. As you start to do exercise in the heat, that will creep up. And so your skin temperature might go up to 96, 7, 8, 99. And one of the goals of body cooling is to keep your skin temperature low, because you want to keep as big of a delta between your body temperature, say you're 104 degrees, your body temperature, and your skin temperature, say it's 94. The bigger that delta is, the more effective you can cool. So if your skin temperature is up at 100 degrees, there's a much smaller gradient for the temperature for that heat to leave your body. The problem is if your skin temperature is 93 sitting here right now, and you go outside in a football practice on August 10th in Tallahassee, and the environmental conditions is 97 degrees outside, and your body temp's 93, you are not losing any heat via convection, radiation, or conduction. So 3 of the 4 methods we have to lose heat are gone. But also the problem with that is that not only are we not losing heat, we're actually absorbing heat from the environment via those 3 methods. So not only are we generating heat through the exercise session, we're now also gathering heat from the environment. So the only thing we have left in those, when the environmental conditions is higher than your skin temperature, the only way you can cool yourself is evaporative heat loss. That's when a sweat droplet appears on your skin and it evaporates into the air. And the evaporation is what actually pulls heat away from your body. But there has to be a water vapor pressure gradient for that to happen, which means there has to be a lower humidity outside in the air versus the humidity on your skin surface. So as you can imagine, because I'm sure many of you are from Florida, the humidity also in the summertime in Tallahassee can be very oppressive. So you might have very high humidity levels, which limits the dissipation of that heat. So you can see why it's so difficult for an American football player in August who's 300 pounds, slightly obese lineman who is doing intense exercise. It's hot out and he has football gear on. And he has very limited ways in which to cool himself. So that is why obviously that's the leading population in America, the Southeast American football player to die from heat stroke. Very challenging. Football in the Southeast should do preseason in January, not in August. That would have been the smarter time to establish your beginning of football practice. And then maybe have the season end more like in the June range, where you can slowly get ready to the heat and acclimatize as it gradually gets hotter, and not start day one on the hottest conditions of the year. Does that make sense? All right. So this is just another kind of visual of some of the things I was showing in the more complicated graph is, what are the things we can do that influence cooling? So intermittent cooling, hydrating yourself, heat acclimatization, and if it's uncompensable heat stress. So have you guys heard of the term uncompensable heat stress?
Yes.
Okay, good. So what that means is you're just generating heat faster than you're able to lose it. And so if you do certain things, we try to do some of the mechanisms like hydration and body cooling to create a compensable heat stress situation so that we can continue to maintain. So our temp might go up to 103.2, but then it holds at 103.2, for, an hour and a half, because we're losing heat at the same rate at which we're generating heat. So those are just some things to consider from that perspective. So this is interesting. This just came out just a few months ago, a good research article, efficacy of heat mitigation strategies on core temperature and endurance exercise, a meta-analysis. So here you have what they did was look at 4 of the biggest factors. Now think of what I just said to you before. What are the biggest factors that influence the rate of rise of your body temperature? And they found the highest ranking, the most biggest connectivity statistically wise to how your body temperature rises is your aerobic fitness. So that's exactly why I said to you before, the intensity of the exercise session is the most important thing. So I'll try to make this relevant. If Mike, are you in the class that's right next to the track right now?
No, we're across campus right now.
Gotcha. Okay. So back where Mike's office is, I've been hanging out with him in his office, and I know back behind the office is the track there. If we all went out on the track and we all ran a 6-minute mile, okay? I said every single one of you runs a 6-minute mile. Now, some of you may struggle to do that, but if you have an elite runner in your class, a 6-minute mile would be super simple, okay? That would be an easy jog running a 6-minute mile if you have someone in the class who or 10 mile. Other people, a 6-minute mile might be the best mile they've ever run in their whole life. And my point here is that if we have a set thing we're asking people to do, like a 6-minute mile, that's going to impact the intensity for someone, because an elite runner, that'll be low intensity. For a non-runner, that will be very high intensity. So that's why aerobic fitness plays such a big role. And if we ever want to keep athletes safe at football practices or soldiers safe during basic training, we don't want to ever give set times for people to do things. Like, you don't want to tell people you have to finish this 8-mile run in a set time, because the fittest people are going to be able to do it easily, and the least fit people are going to have to work so hard and potentially put themselves in danger. So you want to, especially initially in the first few weeks of interacting with people before their fitness level is high, you would rather have them give a task but not give them a set time to finish something in, so that they can do it at their own intensity, relevant to their fitness. Second, you see is heat acclimatization. As we mentioned earlier, cooling, pre-exercise cooling or body cooling was ranked very similar to hydration. So you can see that fitness and acclimatization were way more important than hydration and body cooling. They all mattered, but you could see the relevance of intensity, fitness and acclimatization. So we're going to just run through a few of the big ones. I'm going to try to just give you a little bit of information related to hydration, body cooling, and heat acclimatization. This talk I gave was like a 90-minute talk, so I'm not going to go as in depth. So I'm going to pick out a few important slides. And if you have questions, just make sure just let me know. I'd much rather you guys ask some questions as we're doing these. Okay. So just the basics of hydration. Obviously, there's limited mechanisms to bring fluid in. Obviously, in most of our situations, it's going to be oral. The World Anti-Doping Agency prohibits IV fluids during activity. You can't compete again in the same day if you have IV fluids, even for medical reasons. Only sport in America that allows IV fluids during activity that's not WADA controlled. I don't know. Do they know the term WADA?
Yes.
Okay, good. So it's not WADA controlled would be American football, and they do use IV fluids before a game and during halftime, especially with the big linemen. Obviously, you lose fluids via sweat, respiration, urine, and if you're sick, it could also be in your fecal matter, like in diarrhea. So just for the generalities, we published a paper a few years back looking at, okay, so why does hydration matter? When you lose about 3 to 4% of your body weight, which you may think is a big deal, it happens super quick. That could happen in just an hour of activity if you're not hydrating properly. And if you start the activity dehydrated, it can happen even faster. So you reduce your muscle strength, your muscular power, and your high intensity muscular endurance by some numbers here. And many of you may be saying like, oh, no big deal if it's 3% reduced. But at the elite level, 3% is a big deal for someone, because they're doing everything in the world to try to get like a 1% advantage, and they don't want to give up a few percentage points. This is an interesting one too that came out recently, and why this is interesting. Dr. Kavoris did this study that looks at the speed in kilometers per hour on the left and the power output. So these are cyclists. And you could see that when people are hypohydrated, it's the dark bar or the triangles, there's a slight decrement in speed and a slight decrement in power output. And why this is super interesting is they were only 1.5% dehydrated or hydrated differently in these two groups, which is a tiny, tiny amount. So they were comparing people who were like 2.5% dehydrated to like 1% dehydrated, which could happen, very, very tiny difference. This is just another impact of why hydration matters. This just came out last year. Dehydration impairs cognitive performance, and it was a meta-analysis of every study that had ever been done looking at hydration and cognitive performance, not just during exercise, but it did include exercise. And here you can see this table looks at things, for instance, like your accuracy, like doing like computer-based tasks or reaction times, cognitive domains like attention, executive function, information processing, some of the things that were impacted when it looks at cognitive performance and hydration. So I thought that was relevant. There's a lot of athletes where cognitive performance is obviously critical, or all athletes almost. There's always been speculation on what role hydration has in cramping. There's many people who think that hydration electrolyte influences cramping, other people who think like neuromuscular fatigue. I'm a believer that both of them impact. And this is just an example of an article that came out last year to try to bring back to the notion that hydration and electrolyte deficiency does impact cramping for some people. So the hypohydration, is this term that we're using. What happens physiologically when you're hypohydrated? Why do you get hotter faster? So things like reduced sweating rate, reduced skin blood flow, decreased ability to lose heat. These are things intuitively why we're getting hotter faster. So I'm going to do a quick review of, I think, one study that kind of brings home this point. We published this back in 2010, Influence of Hydration on Physiological Function and Performance During Trail Running in the Heat. And the reason why we did it was for a good 20 or 30 years, people had been showing conclusively that hydration really has a big impact during laboratory studies when people do intense exercise in the heat. But the relationship was not holding true during field studies. And so people were wondering, why are we not seeing the relationship in field studies and why we do see them in lab studies? Does anybody have a guess why?
Environment.
Yep, so that could be environment, but let's say if the environment is the same in the lab and outside. Let's say the lab studies were really good with keeping airflow and wind similar to outside and the environmental conditions are similar. What else could be different, or what else might have been different? So what was that?
We got nothing.
Okay, that's fine. So one thing that I had at least speculated on was that maybe in the field settings, when somebody gets really hot, they slow down their intensity. And if you slow down your intensity, your body temperature lowers. And so at the end of the race, your temperature is not really related to your hydration status because you got fatigued, you slowed down. In the lab studies, intensity is controlled and people can't change their intensity. So as you get hotter, you can't change your intensity and you stay hot. So I had speculated that the field studies were being compromised by self-perceived changes of how they feel, and then they would change their intensity. So we tried to do a field study where we can control this. So I'll give you a little bit of a flavor of what we thought was an intuitive design. What we did was we purposely picked a length of a race of something about an hour. It was a trail run. And we purposely chose something about an hour because you may know that, like, for instance, heat stroke risk is greatest in things that last between 30 and 90 minutes. And the reason for that is that it's short enough that you can hold a high intensity, but long enough to get your body temperature up. So for instance, we don't see heat strokes in a 1 mile race, right? Because 5 minutes isn't long enough to get your temperature up high enough. And then we don't see them as much in marathons. We see them occasionally, but we don't see them in marathons because you usually can't hold a super fast pace to get your temp up for 3 or 4 hours. So we usually see them in more things like 10Ks, 12Ks, 15Ks, 10 milers, half marathons, and then sprint and Olympic distance triathlons. So we wanted to do something that would mimic that. But we had people race 4 times, we had people come 4 times. 2 times they raced. So we wanted to see a maximal output. And 1 time they were hydrated and 1 time they were dehydrated. And that was randomized in terms of the order in which they got that. And we also made sure that the wet bulb globe temperature was within 2 degrees Fahrenheit on both of their race days. So the environmental conditions would be very, very similar. Then on 2 other days, they did a submaximal exercise. And the first time they came, we got their pace like every half mile along the way for 7.5 miles. And then the second time they did it, we told them where they were related to their pace the previous time they did it. And why we did that was we wanted to have them match their pace exactly on both sessions, even though 1 time they were hydrated and 1 time they were dehydrated. And again, we had them to be the same environmental conditions. So I hope you kind of understand that in trials 2 and 3, we're controlling the intensity so that they finish with the same exact finishing time. So we can look at physiological variables with the same finishing time and just compare hydrated versus dehydrated. And in the 2 races, we're not controlling their intensity. And we theorize people would go slower when they're dehydrated. And to motivate them, because we did this in July in very hot conditions, the 2 race times were combined to determine prize money. So we motivated them to go hard on both our hydrated and dehydrated days, and we had very legitimate prize money. We're talking like $1,500 for first place and $1,250 for second and $1,000 for third. So people were motivated by the sum of money that we were offering. So what we found was that the same relationships we had found in the lab previously held true when we did this sub-max intensity. Those 2 times they had to match their intensity, but only hydration was different. So this is an example of one runner, minus 4.5% and minus 2% dehydrated. And here you can see that their heart rate was 179 versus 165, which is 14 different. And it ended up being about 6% body mass loss for every additional percent dehydration. And that actually holds very true with the literature from the lab, which is about 5 beats per minute different. And here you can notice that recovery was very slow after for people dehydrated, about 10 beats per minute different for every additional percent body mass loss. So the lab relationships held true on the 2 submaximal intensity days when you were able to control that intensity and have them have the same exact finishing times. We found the same relationship with body temperature. You can see it was about 1 degree Fahrenheit difference, but it ended up being about 0.4 degrees for every additional percent body mass loss, or 0.22 degrees Celsius, which is ironically the exact number we found on a meta-analysis that we published for all the lab studies that had ever been done. So we were able, I think, to refute a little some of the naysayers that saying hydration didn't matter in a field setting when you could properly control for the mechanisms that were at play. This is that meta-analysis that we published of all the different exercise sessions that had looked at the influence of hydration during intense exercise in the heat. And it shows you about 0.22. You can see on the screen there, if you can see my arrow, but the average there of all the trials. Those are all different studies, not subjects. So anyway, so that was an overview of that, what we found in the trail running study. And just so you know, I don't have the results here for time reasons. The race one, we did find what we thought, and the dehydrated group were significantly slower, about 1.5 minutes slower, by just being just 2% dehydrated differently during the race. And they, so I think that was interesting. So another thing, an interesting study that came out last year is when we do lab studies, it's hard to blind people to the drinking process, right? Because you drink orally and you know when you're getting fluids versus when you don't. So they had an intuitive study that they did at University of Arkansas. Again, it was Dr. Kavoris. And so they actually had, hold on a sec.
Videos don't generally play well on our end.
That's fine. It had popped up for a second, then I stopped it. So this is during the study. Notice he has some like an IV kind of placed in his arm there, in his forearm. What they did in this particular study was they, you can see it's a blinded study, dehydration impairs cycling performance. They gave fluid via IV, but they did not tell the people if they were getting the fluid or not. So the fluid was infused from behind, and they didn't know if it was a day they were getting fluid or not, because people have also speculated that the fluid is happening, they know they're drinking, so it's a placebo effect. So they eliminated that, and they also gave them a small bolus of fluid to have everyone be at the same thirst level, so perceptually it would be similar from an oropharyngeal reflex perspective. So it's a very innovative study, and they found it was just a 2% dehydration difference, and they found performance, they found core temperature was higher when they were a little bit more dehydrated, not surprisingly, but they found big difference in cycling speed and power. Cycling speed was better when they were hydrated, and power was better. So that was a blinded study looking at the effects of hydration.
Was that core temp with a pill or with a probe?
I think it, yeah, it was, I think a probe. It's not esophageal, the study.
Okay.
Yep. So another, this is an ad libitum, another innovative study that Dr. Kavoris had done. Ad libitum, you probably know the term, is just drinking when you want and as much as you want. And they looked at prescribed drinking versus ad libitum. And the reason being is that people who drink ad libitum often only drink about 60 to 70% of their losses. And if you're drink prescribed, we obviously get you a little closer to matching your sweat rate. And they found that that small difference actually impacted performance, that prescribed drinking was better, especially at the end. You can see at the end in the 25 to 30 kilometers, the speed decreased for people who were ad libitum. So that small difference in hydration, only like 1 or 1.5% difference, had an impact. So when we talk about helping athletes with hydration status, best ways to do it are first morning urine color, thirst, and body weight. In fact, we're developing like an app right now to help athletes because if you have all three of them, you're very, very likely to be dehydrated. If you have a body weight change from a previous day, if your urine color is dark, and if you're thirsty. If you have only one, it's not as telling. And if you have two, it's a little more telling. But obviously in the Venn diagram, if you have the intersection of all three is the most telling.
Doug, Sam spoke to our university yesterday.
That is very ironic.
Yes, he said to say hi.
All right, that's awesome. That's so funny. So yeah, so Sam came up with this Venn diagram, as you can see from the citation. So we thought this was pretty interesting. We literally just published this in the journal Nutrients 2 days ago. We first published it as an abstract, as you can see here, in 2017. We thought you'd find this interesting because people always say like thirst is generally a very good indicator of hydration for the general population and recreational athletes because it'll keep you under the 2% dehydrated. But for people who have large fluid turnovers in short periods of time, like firefighters and high-level soldiers and athletes, sometimes, let's say you're very dehydrated from a first half of a football game. You go in to halftime and you drink a liter of fluid and your thirst disappears. But that disappearing of thirst does not mean that you're rehydrated. And here you can see this figure, that one kind of square in the black line that does a big drop in the middle of the screen. That was the group that got fluid, but they're still dehydrated. So their thirst is that what you're looking at, the thirst levels, and it precipitously drops their thirst levels down to the same as the hydrated group. But that group is still 3% dehydrated, even their thirst has abated. So acutely, after intense high fluid turnover, thirst might not be the best way to really knowing what your fluid needs are and why we've recommended individualized rehydration. So I'm going to go on to just cover some basics with heat acclimatization.
Okay.
What time's your class end?
It ends at 9:15.
Okay. So I'll go like another 15 minutes and let some people have some questions.
Perfect.
Okay. So just terminology, acclimation, acclimatization. Acclimation is what we do in a lab when we help athletes, like, artificial heat. Obviously, acclimatization is what would happen naturally in the heat. You've probably covered this before, but the physiological changes that happen over the course of the first 3 to 10 days of exercise in the heat and why we see the performance benefits. Back in 2009, we tried to come up with some guidelines for heat acclimatization for the high school level because college had done it back in 2003 with a lot of success. So we're trying to get all 50 states to adapt heat acclimatization guidelines. That would be, for instance, the phasing in of equipment and length of practices and number of practices across days. The reason why we want to do this heat acclimatization is that you can see there's a precipitous drop in the amount of heat illnesses in the first week of activity. This is actual high school football players in Georgia over a 4-year research study. And you can see after that first week of activity, we see a big drop. So we're trying to do a lot to try to protect them in that first week. We actually did a cool study, a few different studies looking at the effectiveness of heat acclimatization. One we just recently published in a public health journal that looked at every state that had heat acclimatization versus those that don't. And we found about a 55% reduction in heat illnesses nationally for states that have the heat acclimatization guidelines, which is obviously a massive number from a public health perspective, because that's scaled on 8 million high school athletes in America. So there's a lot of people influenced. And then we also did an interesting study in Georgia where I mentioned to you this graph here. That was 4 years of data for high school football. But then they instituted guidelines after those 4 years. And then we kept doing the data collection for 4 more years after. And we found about a 70% reduction in heat illnesses after Georgia adopted the heat acclimatization guidelines. So we had a real robust data set for pre-policy and post-policy in the same population, which was pretty cool. So these are 2 different studies. They've actually both come out now. This one with Journal of Athletic Training was the Georgia one, compared pre and post. And then the Public Health Journal just came out, this other one where I said it was a national, when we looked at it nationally. So when you talk about heat acclimatization, that's one of the big things we help elite athletes with. So at our lab at University of Connecticut at the Korey Institute, we have world-class athletes come in on about a weekly basis, either runners, soldiers, special forces soldiers, triathletes, cyclists. They come in to be tested with us to get an idea of where they are with their heat preparedness. And then some actually live here for periods of time so that they can get heat acclimatized and we can monitor their heat acclimatization for them before they're getting ready, for instance, like the World Championships for the Ironman Triathlon. Some of the top triathletes in the world, some of the top people who finished in the top 3 in the big races in the last few weeks have come with work with us. So a couple of things why heat acclimatization matters from a research perspective. This study came out 2 years ago out of Zach Schlater's lab at the University of Buffalo, who's now at Indiana University. They looked at how do you heat up, day after day after day. And they found that the second day when you come and do an exercise session, if you do the same exact exercise session in the same exact environmental conditions at the same intensity and the same hydration status, you heat up faster on the second day versus the first day. So there's obviously some lingering stress from the first day that's causing us to heat up faster. And another reason why probably almost all heat strokes, 80% of heat strokes happen on day 2 or 3 of activity. And this may have some connectivity to that interesting response. This is just an example of some of the results from that study. Exacerbated heat response on day 2. We did an interesting study that is not published yet. I think it just got accepted or it's in the final phases of review right now. It's an interesting study that I'll tell you the design really quickly because I think it's worth explaining. This is from Rihanna Pryor, who's actually now at University of Buffalo. What we did was we wanted to kind of recreate a football scenario. So we had people do a 2-a-day exercise session on day 1, 2.5 hours in the morning, 2.5 hours in the afternoon in the heat lab, really hard exercise. And then we had them come back the next morning and do the same 2.5 hour bout again. So we were looking at 2 things. Within day, do you heat up more the second time versus the first time? And then across days, day 1 to day 2, do you heat up more on day 2 versus day 1? But then interestingly, we didn't end there. What we did then was do a week of heat acclimatization with all the people, like, a single exercise session per day for a week. And then we redid that same thing again, a 2-a-day exercise session followed by the same exercise session the next morning. So what we found was that 22% less time to reach exhaustion on day 2 versus day 1 doing the same exercise session, and 18% faster rate of your rise in your body temperature on day 2. So you're heating up faster and you're getting exhausted faster. And then obviously, not surprisingly, but it just shows support for heat acclimatization. That relationship did not hold true after they got heat acclimatized, which, that kind of proved our point of why we want people to become heat acclimatized. So that study is going to be coming out, I'm going to say in a couple months.
How many days did they acclimatize in the middle?
I think we did 5, but you have to really count those first 2, right, of the 2 exercise sessions. Because we did K1, 2 a day, and then day 2, and then 5 regular days, and then they did another thing. So it probably ended up being 7 days of heat ac. That makes sense?
Yep.
Okay. So this is just some of the things that happen with heat acclimatization. I mentioned before, plasma volume, increased sweat rates, increased skin blood flow, and enhanced performance in hot conditions. But there's some people believe, especially for high-level athletes, that you might see an improved performance also in cool weather after getting heat acclimatized. And there's some evidence from Dr. Minson's lab at University of Oregon to prove that to be true. And the expansion of plasma volume would be a super easy way to understand or conceptualize why that might be helpful for a high-level athlete, especially where the intensity is so high that you can't rehydrate during the activity. So I'll give you an example. So by a show of hands, did anyone follow in the last few weeks when somebody broke the 2-hour marathon for the first time ever? There you go. Okay, so interesting things, right? Because in the span of 2 days, the guy broke the 2-hour marathon. Now, it's not a legal record, as many of you probably know, because he was paced by different people who came in and out of the race during that time, and it wasn't a formal race. But he still conceptually showed that you can break 2 hours. And then the next day, a woman by almost 2 minutes broke the world record in the marathon at the Chicago Marathon. But the guy breaking it, the 2 hours on that Saturday, he averaged 437 miles. So I don't know if we have any runners here, but a 437 mile for 26 miles in a row. So if that just fascinates you, I'd encourage you to watch that hour documentary that came out last year that Nike did when their attempt to break the 2-hour marathon, when they did a 2:01. Or I'm sorry, 2 hours and like 50 something seconds, and they got within a minute of breaking it, and they did a documentary. Super fascinating. Two of the people helping them do that in the documentary are my former PhD students at UCONN who work for Nike. So it's interesting to see that kind of from the inside. But this is a complicated graph, but it shows the benefits in the heat and possible benefits in the cold as well. And you can see on the left % change from pre-acclimation. And, you know, the dark ones is exercise in the heat. And at the bottom, you could see VO2 max improves, lactate threshold, and other factors down there with 4 different items. And you could see control group, those people who did not get heat acclimatized, but still did the exercise sessions. And you can see, obviously, there was much bigger difference with heat acclimation. But there was also performance benefits in the cool as well. So that was interesting for people to conceptualize. So I'm not going to get into these as much, but so that was just a little bit of an overview of heat ac. I'm just going to spend 1 sec on body cooling. So body cooling, I believe, is one of the most underutilized ergogenic aids in sport. And I'm not talking about cooling to help someone from a safety perspective or someone has a heat stroke. I'm talking about cooling during activity to enhance athletic performance. So during half times, during break periods, when you're not in playing, anything to get your body temperature down so that you might be at 102 and your competition's at 104. So I'm going to just give an example here. 2004 Olympic marathon. We traditionally have not done well in the marathon for America, besides for Joan Benoit. I don't think we had medaled in maybe since 76. But we took a very proactive strategy preparing for the Athens Olympics. Up to that time, that was the hottest Summer Olympics in history. And they kind of pulled off the trifecta of the things I'm mentioning today. What they did was they went 3 weeks before the Olympics to a Greek island near Athens. So they, dealt with all the circadian rhythms issues for time zone changes right off the bat. And then they got to very similar environmental conditions to what their race would be in. So they got fully heat acclimatized in a 3-week stretch. And then they also used pre-cooling before all of their training runs for 3 weeks to get their body temperature down by about 2 to 3 degrees before starting training runs. So similar to what they did in the actual race itself. So some runners, regular people who didn't do cooling, it was the women's race was like 92 degrees at the start. Paula Radcliffe, who had set the world record the year before in 2:15, she at mile 12 was sitting on a curb. And she was heavily favored. She was 5 minutes faster than any other person in the race. And she was sitting on a curb at mile 12 with the heat exhaustion because she had done her same warm-up before the race and she overheated so quickly. And the Americans did a little bit of a warm-up, but they did it with ice vests on it and cooling towels. And then they went into an air-conditioned room with cooling stuff right before the race and started the race probably 95 or 96 degrees Fahrenheit. So they had a much bigger window to work with before they got up to thresholds with it. People would become volitionally exhausted and start to back off on their intensity. And then in addition to that, so they have heat acclimatization covered, they have body cooling covered. But then third, they got their hydration down. By being there 3 weeks early, your sweat rate changes, and they learned what their sweat rates were after getting heat acclimatized and developed individualized hydration, and then practiced it during their training efforts during that 3 weeks, and then implemented that during the race. We had 2 people medal and 2 other people finish in the top 10. So that was a big deal for us for traditionally very poor distance running. So that was an example. So when we talk about cooling methods, is obviously we have to consider the sport, like, and what we do during cooling. So like when I work with the Portugal national team and our US national soccer teams, when they have exercise in the heat, we do very aggressive halftime cooling. Soccer players will catch you by surprise that many of them will be 104 degrees at halftime, their body temperature, just from 45 minutes of doing intense exercise in the heat. And these are some strategies. Some of them are less effective than others. So we have to think about what the cooling rates are of the different ones. This is an example of different cooling options and the efficiencies. Cold water immersions on the right side of the graph, usually looking at 0.2 to 0.4 degrees Celsius per minute cooling rate. So cold water immersion is the best. The next best things would be freezing cold, wet towels over the whole body and covering as much of the skin surface area as possible. Cooling rates are going to be directly tied to the amount of skin surface area that you have. So next, after we think about the modality we're going to use, we have to think about the timing of the cooling. So for athletes, between bouts of exercise might be like in football when you're on offense and you come off when your defense is on the field, that would be between bouts. Before exercise is called per cooling. So like a NFL lineman, from Cleveland Browns playing at the Miami Dolphins, making sure they're cooling before the activity so they're not hot during the warm-up. During exercise, could be what I just said before, whereas between bouts, the example I gave, that might be like during halftime. Recovery could be after activity to get someone's temperature down lower because they might have to have another exercise session in a couple hours and might want to recover faster. So these are some other strategies to stay cool. I don't have time to go through all these, but just an example of some of the strategies we will offer to athletes that we work with. Another cooling from the inside, you might have heard of ice slushies. But during really intense exercise in the heat, there's some potential for bringing some cold in with the fluid, whether it be with a slushy drink or just a cold beverage, could be helpful. This is an example of halftime cooling and pre-cooling. So just showing the benefits of people hot versus cold. Power output is lower, heart rate is higher, stroke volume is lower. Kind of intuitively what you might think things may happen. This is from Sebastian Racinas from Doha, Aspetar, some of the work that he's done. So this is another one just looking at ice bath, ice vest, and control. And here you can see the ice bath really starts to take effect especially like in that 30, 40 minute window. So this is just practical applications. The big thing is trying to get the temp down compared to, if you didn't use cooling strategies. Every sport takes a different bit of a challenge to think where all the windows are for break periods that you could utilize to take advantage of, and then what would be the appropriate modality in each of the circumstances. Okay, so I'm going to stop it there, Mike, and open up the floor for questions. We're right around 9 o'clock.
All right, let's thank Dr. Casa.
Hey, thank you, sir, for your talk. How does pre-event cooling impact your ability to acclimate to the heat?
So that's a good question. So heat, you may remember that meta-analysis that I showed you really early on in my presentations where they ranked the different factors. So heat acclimatization is by far much more important than body cooling. So you'd want to get your heat acclimatization all done over the course of a couple of weeks, and then the cooling is going to just give you a little additional advantage to try to keep your temp down. While you're in the process of heat acclimatizing, you don't need to use cooling strategies because you actually, for a heat acclimatization session to count for our perspective, we recommend at least an hour of activity with your body temperature over 102 degrees. So when we bring people into the lab, once they hit 102 is when we start the stopwatch and make sure they get at least an hour of exercise during that hyperthermic state. So we first get heat acclimatized, and then we develop cooling strategies to try to give us a little additional advantage during the activity.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So when it comes to like the Ironman, and you've got an athlete running through maybe one aid station and they can only pick maybe one area to put ice on, or the sponges, does it matter whether it's like on the neck versus say maybe on the kidneys that might be like filtering your blood? Does it matter? Or does it just matter that there's ice on the athlete?
It's a good question. So I don't know if anybody's ever been at, 3 times I've been at the World Championships in Kona, and some of the most brutal conditions you could ever imagine, because the most elite people have to be on the blacktop surface right at 1 or 2 o'clock in the afternoon doing the marathon, and it's like always in the 90 something degrees. So it's a good question. So pre-cooling would never matter in a triathlon because you're obviously going straight into the water for the first thing. So the cooling strategies you have left, you have to consider what you can do on the bike and the run, and the bike probably gives you more opportunities. So for instance, ice packs or cold towels underneath the helmet on top of the head, anything that you might be able to put across the shoulders or down the back. They have different, towels or different things that they might be able to keep on them. And then those could be changed out at different stations. Slushy drinks could be helpful. Drinking cold beverages, just hydration alone by minimizing the percent dehydration obviously is going to limit the increase in your body temperature. Making sure you're acclimatized beforehand will limit rise. Making sure the elite people arrive to Kona 3 weeks before. And then making sure you're hydrated at the start. And then other things you might be able to do during the run, like freezing cold wet towels on your head or over your shoulders. Anything like that could help. Anything that keeps your skin temperature down is going to be helpful. But you got to keep remembering to drink. What happens sometimes is when you have a decrease in your skin temperature, sometimes that might decrease someone's motivation to drink because your body feels a little bit cooler, but you're not hydrating yourself, obviously, by cooling yourself, but by just putting something externally on. So we got to make sure we also drink while we're doing the external cooling.
Thank you.
You ever seen Remember the Titans?
Oh, yeah.
There's a scene where a guy named Blue wants a water break, and Denzel Washington goes, water is weak, water is for quitters. What do you say to those kind of highly machismo guys who kind of think that way?
Yeah, so thankfully, we don't see that as much now. The big thing I would tell a coach is if you want more out of your player and if you want him to perform better at the end of an activity, obviously someone who hydrated well during a game is going to be at their best at the end of the game. But to give you a couple examples to support what you're saying, Joe Paterno, for years at Penn State, the start at every practice, he would go out with bags of oatmeal and put it in every single cooler that was set up by the athletic trainers on the field, so that the water would be disgusting and that people wouldn't hydrate during the practice. Wow. So obviously we turned out he's quite a loser from all the other ways they handled the pedophilia stuff there. But here you can see he was not very adept at dealing with hydration for the athletes, but that was pretty typical during that time. We've had nightmare stories from University of Alabama with Bear Bryant back in the 60s and 70s, and other situations like that. So yeah, it's thankfully we've slowly, just from the passing of time, gotten away from people thinking that. And obviously, just from this presentation today, you've seen the protective from a you have less hyperthermia if you stay hydrated. So it's a safety issue, but then you also saw me show performance benefits when you stay well hydrated. And thankfully at the high levels of sport, directors of performance, athletic trainers, and other people, have permeated the world enough, I think, that we're hopefully getting the right information, at the right places.
Doug, if you were to debate waterlogged, what would be your opening argument? So
the book, are you talking about the book?
Yeah.
Oh yeah. So, but as I mentioned before, when you're dealing with recreational athletes, so 99% of the people at the Boston Marathon or New York City Marathon, we would always recommend them using thirst to determine their hydration status, because it would prevent them from ever over drinking, and it would minimize dehydration to no more than 2% dehydration. And we would eliminate the cases of hyponatremia and not have to worry about anyone becoming waterlogged. And that's always my recommendation for any recreational athlete who's just looking to participate in the triathlon, in the run, in the cycling event. But for that other 1%, the person who's the elite athlete soldier, who does want to utilize hydration to also enhance their performance, I do recommend them knowing their sweat rates in different environmental conditions and different intensities, and then developing a plan so that they can rehydrate based on their own individual needs, because obviously sweat rates can be very different across people, than can be different within a person across different circumstances. So that would be my, I think, the way that we have, successfully tried to have athletes avoid either too much dehydration or anybody overhydrating.
Now, in this class, most of the students are sports nutrition students and not ATC. In your mind, whose role is it, or is it a combined role, to protect these athletes, particularly with hydration? We see it on the TV sidelines. These guys live it in their GA positions and such.
Mm-hmm.
But who, is it the sports nutrition people, or is it the ATC folks that should take the lead on this?
It's a good question. I think I would always recommend that collaboration and working together is probably more useful. At the college level, especially the high-end level, like where you guys are at, I would always recommend wanting to know the sweat rates of my athletes. It's so simple to figure out, and especially people who have problems. So, you weigh people before and after practice. If people are coming in a lot lighter versus before, it's very likely those are your people that either one of two things. They're the ones who have the high sweat rates, or they're the people who are not actively rehydrating during practice, or both. So when I was at University of Florida, we had some people finish practice 18, 19, 20 pounds lighter from one practice. And at first, I really couldn't conceptualize how that was possible from a 3-hour practice. But then I started to understand my field a little bit more. And then I started to see, okay, well, if you have a 3.5 liter per hour sweat rate, we're up to like 10 to 11 liters in a practice that someone could lose. And if you know 1 liter is 1 kilogram, that's 22, 23 pounds of fluid. So the people, if you weigh them before and after and they've lost a ton, the people, let's just say you might have 10 out of the 100 that lost a ton. Those particular people, I'd really want to know their sweat rates, or help work with them to develop during practice hydration strategies. And I'm not trying to completely replace all the fluid, but if someone is 7% dehydrated at the end of a practice, I want to really work with them to maybe get that down to 3% dehydrated at the end of a practice, and then use the meal after, or the 2 to 3 hours after the activity, to get the rest of the fluid back. And I feel like all of that time after the practice and helping them develop these strategies, the sport nutritionist is integral in that, and having the right strategies and infrastructure and support during the practice, is going to be a lot of the athletic trainer's role, to make sure it's accessible, that it's being encouraged, and that it's there's appropriate work to rest ratios based on the environmental conditions and worked within the structure of the practice dynamics. So I see a role for both of those entities.
Okay. It looks like 2 more questions from the class, and we'll be good.
Thank you for your talk. I do have 2 questions. My first one is, how long do the physiological changes from heat acclimation last?
That's a great question. So we actually, that study I mentioned earlier, that we did it and then 5 days and then we did everything again, we actually tracked those people for 35 days after. And we actually, one of the groups did a heat acclimation session for one time every 5 days for 35 days. And we were able to, in that dynamic, we were able to hold on to the heat acclimation, about 2/3 of it over the 35 days. We're doing another massive study right now. It's an 8-month study where we tested people back in May and June, used the natural acclimatization in the summer, and then topped it off with 5 more days at the end of the summer. And now we have 3 groups. We have a 1 day a week, a 2 day a week, and a no day a week. And then we're testing them every 3 weeks over a 9-week stretch. So this has been thousands and thousands of visits for these 50 subjects in the study, in total. And so that's finishing in the next 2 to 3 weeks. And we're trying to look at the exact question that you just asked. So we believe that the 2 a day will be obviously better than the 1 a day, but the 1 a day will be better than nothing. And we'll get an idea of the curve of how long each of those groups hold on to, what percentage of the benefits.
Awesome. I'll definitely look out for that.
Yeah.
My second question is, in your field study race, how do you dehydrate an athlete and how do you maintain that percentage of dehydration?
That's a great question. Good. So during the race, well, first of all, beforehand, we figured out their sweat rates when we interacted with the people on some pre-testing. And then during the race, we had different spots during the race to have them, drink a certain amount, so that I think they finished the race 2% dehydrated on the hydrated group, and then the dehydrated group finished at 4% dehydration because they didn't get fluids. So we call that kind of partial rehydration, which is more realistic in the athletic setting because it's very difficult at high intensities to match sweat rate.
And when you guys do a sweat rate testing and pre-testing, what's your go-to method for that?
We typically have them in the lab. We try to mimic environmental conditions that we think we'll face in whatever trial we're doing, and we have them go at, we've already done their VO2 max, so we have an idea of what kind of pace they could hold, for a 7-mile race. And we do something to mimic it to try to get a sweat rate. I mean, we have other ways of doing it in the lab for high-level athletes where we usually do like a 2-hour test, which would be more relevant for marathon runners and cyclists and triathletes because they're going for long periods of time. And we also, for a triathlete, we'll do it on the bike and then do another session the next day running because people's sweat rates are higher when you run versus biking. And
you're just doing the body weights pre-post and the fluid counting?
Yeah, so we do, yeah, exactly. So amount of urine consumed, amount of fluid consumed, calculations for potential respiratory changes, pre and post body weight. But when we're done with that whole session too, we also do whole body washdowns. We're one of the few labs in the world that do whole body washdowns, which is probably one of the big reasons people visit us. And that is a collection of all the sodium that has left their body during an exercise session. And then we wash them off with a standard amount of deionized water, then collect the sodium. And if we know the amount of water that it's diluted in, then we can obviously measure the amount of sodium in their sweat. So we can tell people their exact sweat rates during certain environmental conditions and intensity. But then we also can tell people what their sweat electrolyte losses are during those same sessions. So when we come up with a rehydration plan, it's not just amount, it's also concentration.
That's great. One of the tools that is available is that precision hydration technology where they put that suction cup on your forearm and
yes,
try to see what's going on. How does that compare to the full body washdown?
So those, and that's just like sweat patches. There's other technologies out there too. And there's new high-end technologies with, more like, electronics being used with sweat collection as well. But those are just predictions. Every single thing like that is a prediction, and you're making an estimate from one body site. If that's an estimate of what your whole body calculation would be. And it's kind of tough from your forearm or your forehead or your leg if everyone's going to be sweating at similar rates. Our method doesn't have any prediction involved because we're just collecting all the sodium that someone sweats during an exercise session.
And that's wonderful. And I think just for one quick personal thought, if you have an athlete come in who's not acclimatized and you have them do a VO2 max test in normal temperatures versus a hot temperature, would you expect a different number?
Oh yeah. Yeah. So, so it'd probably be about, I'm going to say 7 to 10% worse in the hot conditions.
So I'm just thinking it's interesting for these folks, if they're doing any kind of field testing, the condition in which they measure that and the season in which they're measuring that could make a big difference in what they're doing for their training scope.
Oh, no question.
Recommendations.
Yeah. When we come up with all of our strategies, we're always trying to, we try to do testing in different environmental conditions so that we get an idea of, what it will be for them if they face those different environmental conditions.
Doug, you're a wealth of knowledge, and I always enjoy learning from you. Thank you so much for your time today. Let's give him a round of applause again.
All right. Thank you, guys. Have a great weekend.
Thanks. We'll be in touch later. Thank you so much.
Yeah, all right.